my name's Loretta Anania. I work for the Commission. I joined the second framework program in the broadband, to put broadband all over Europe. So I'm quite enthusiastic about broadband. As a researcher, I'm enthusiastic about the use of data. But the reason I actually submitted this proposal about a year and a half ago, because this was supposed to be a live event in the German presidency, hence the Road to Mannheim 2020, is that I had such a wonderful time, Michelangelo, you might remember, opening an era of social innovation. This was a huge event with 3 DGs in Lisbon, and we had the Gulbenkian Museum, and we were running, I don't know how many workshops. Geoff Mulgan had at least a whole day of citizen participation workshops. And our session was on digital welfare. And this is a topic very close to my heart because, as you know, the universal income is one of the best ways of making an impact on poverty. Now, the COVID crisis has really increased the gap between the rich and the poor, the employed and the unemployed. And in several of the projects presented in Lisbon, we launched some of the top social innovation digital platforms. I can mention one in Lisbon, Lisbon Open City, for example. At the time, 17% of the Lisbon discretionary budget was decided by the citizens themselves. Okay, so participative budgeting or open care was another way. So using the internet, using the 3D printers, so that people who had to come to a room with a wheelchair needed to raise the table or lower. All of these things were printed in some of my projects so as to facilitate inclusion at local grassroots level. The reason I loved Lisbon was also that if we are here to discuss social innovation, the person that had the most impact on our field is Diogo Vasconcelos, who worked at Cisco and created the social exchange. And
seems Loretta froze, at least for me. Michelangelo, for you too?
For me too, yes. Let's just give a few seconds.
Yeah, what we can do, we give her a minute, and otherwise maybe we
can go on.
We move on with the presentations and self-regulate.
I think Loretta warned me that there was this risk that she was having some unstable connection. So if this was going to happen, to move on. So that was a direction.
Okay. So do you think this is what we have to do? So I see that there are six very precious people in the audience. Let's see if Loretta, I see her reconnected, but I'm not sure. Yeah, let's do the following, Michelangelo. Let's self-regulate. I think in the order of the program, I was giving the first presentation, you were giving the second, right?
That's it.
Meaning that Geoff was there. So what I'll do, I'll start sharing my screen and perhaps echo a little bit of what I've heard from Loretta and try and get started with my own presentation. First of all, Loretta chose these presentations and these topics already a while ago, and I think she demonstrated to have quite a little bit of foresight in that sense, because the topic that she has chosen is a topic that is on our table today, even more importantly than it was a year and a half ago. Also because we've seen the publication of the Data Governance Act. We are looking forward to seeing also the proposed Data Act. I see Geoff has joined us. Geoff, we are self-regulating because Loretta has problems with the connection. So we will move on. I will give my presentation, then I'll hand over to, I think, Michelangelo, and then you. I think that's the original order. Okay.
No, I think now that's Geoff back. I think he's the next one.
Okay, Geoff will be the second. Okay.
If you want to keep it as you want.
Okay, super. So what I'll do, I'll share my screen. I'll try to be complementary a little bit with what others will say, and reflect a little bit on this topic and on trust in data sharing. So I assume you're seeing my screen and the slides. The slides are in PDF. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to show animations on those slides. So some of the figures will just come up a little bit all at once. The first thing that I wanted to reflect on is when we talk about incentivizing data sharing, I think we have to qualify this statement a little bit, because if you look at this from an economics perspective, let me see. If you look at this from I'll probably go this way, from an economics perspective. Okay, yeah, there is a very good reason why it's not working. If you look at this from an economics perspective, information has been defined originally as a public good, as something that typically cannot be easily excluded in terms of consumption by third parties. It is also typically non-rival, meaning that its value increases, and in some cases increases exponentially as more people share the information. And to some extent, I associate this original stance towards information, which is the typical stance that economists set towards public good, with also the original enthusiasm for unconstrained data sharing that we've seen in the early days of the internet, right? Where in principle, information was big, and data and information goods were all included in the same big cauldron, and we call it the big commons. And it's very difficult to ensure that someone can constrain the sharing of information, and it's very easy for others to appropriate the information. Early cases of this have occurred, for example, in the intellectual property rights space. If you think about all the Napster saga, for example, on peer-to-peer file sharing and subsequent case law, for example, with Grokster, Morpheus, Kazaa, and many other peer-to-peer file sharing systems that use different types of network architectures and business models. Indeed, if you look at the information more closely, and you go down one level of detail, you discover that the information is a very diverse good, and certainly not always a public good. There are certain types of information which could include, to some extent, very personal information, but not necessarily only that. So that can include some types of industrial information, industrial data, for example, that gradually lose value in their utility function the more they are shared. There are also, most types of information actually reach a peak in their value at the finite level of sharing, and there's other type of information, and there's also quite a lot of information that indeed is increasing its values for the original, let's call it owner, although the term is legally inappropriate, of the information. Increases its value exponentially, and increases also its social value exponentially the more it's shared. For example, that is obviously a stupid example. You want to plan a revolution. The plan to implement and execute the revolution has a value, has no value if it's only shared. Well, if it's not shared, it has a limited value. It reaches a peak in its value when it's shared with a certain number of people that needs to implement that plan. It completely loses the value if it's shared immediately, because the secrecy of the plan is functional to its execution in general. Then obviously you can question whether the revolution will be good for society or not. But indeed, in terms of mere utility function, information follows different streams, and here they are illustrated with different colors. So indeed, depending on which economist or social scientist has been looking at information in the past, it's been defined as a public good, in other cases a very private good, especially on the internet in some cases, with all the debate on intellectual property rights over data. In some other cases, a club good or commons, or in some parts of the literature, a semi-commons. So I can obviously elaborate a little bit more on this in case there's need. This is something, indeed, that I had myself started to conceptualize when I was a kid, basically, when I was out of university in my BA thesis. I saw that recently, for example, Diane Coyle and others, in looking at the value of data, have come up with something very similar. For example, information reaching a peak of its value in some cases when it's kept closed, in other cases when it's shared, and in other cases when it's open. Now, that is very important also because if you look at the value of data, and if you want to maximize the value of data, I'm afraid you cannot find a one-size-fits-all solution over the internet. Now, this is for a sort of snapshot of the characteristics of information from an economic lens and from an information theory lens that determine the combination of which determines the different strategies that one can implement in order to optimize this information and the value and the level of sharing of this information for society as a whole. Well, my thesis here is that when the World Wide Web entered our lives in the mid-90s, we actually implemented a model that was all for open information and obviously has enormous virtues. And to some extent, during this morning's panel, we will continue to praise sharing of information whenever possible, especially when information increases its value for society when it's shared, right? But there was no real nuance in the original design of the internet in this respect. And this has created an enormous production of information, obviously, and enormous sharing in secondary markets, if you wish, for information, where information that is introduced on the World Wide Web by one user can infinitely being shared and redistributed in a network that has, in the end-to-end architecture, one of its main features. Now, this has had obviously enormous advantages for the web and for cyberspace as a whole. At the same time, though, the overabundance of information has also created an enormous need for re-intermediation, and it has also created centripetal forces that have brought this information in the hands of a fistful of players. So 3 decades down the road, if you wish, we found ourselves with the original layered architecture of the internet having now a fat middle, where on top of the typical open internet, we have cloud-based platforms that typically attract most of the value and most of the data. And this creates asymmetries in an environment in which perhaps the thing that is least common is voluntary data sharing. Among the many forms of data sharing that one could have imagined, what is not happening, given the value the data have accumulated and have gained over time, is that what is not happening is a more nuanced approach and a more, let's say, diverse way in which data are shared in transactions, are kept closed whenever needed, and are made open and openly available, for example, to researchers whenever needed. This is not happening. Many researchers in this field have spotted in the data environment a number of asymmetries, a number of imperfections that require action, and not necessarily action that could be left to the spontaneous forces of the internet themselves. Because just as a biological entity, as a living entity, the internet has transformed itself over time to optimize its functioning, and this optimization has required, especially given the scarcity of our attention, the emergence of players who are able to capture our attention, to offer us content, to rank it, to order it for us. And this has obviously created enormous opportunities also in their hands. And they have not failed to exploit these opportunities, sometimes for good, and in other cases also not necessarily for the good of society, right? So today we're looking at information in different ways. This comes from Citra, but I've added something in between, which is the platforms, which is not in the original scheme of possible forms of data exchanges. We have the challenge of trying to stimulate more person-to-person data sharing whenever needed, person-to-business data sharing, business-to-business data sharing, and sharing between persons, businesses, and government, and on the other way around, right? In particular, the making available of data from governments to persons and businesses, including for the purposes of social innovation. In the middle, there's also still something that Citra had not included in the original visualization, which is the platforms. In most cases, the exchange of data between persons and businesses, but also in many cases between governments and both P's and B's, persons and businesses, is mediated still by the platforms through large cloud-based environments that, even in the case of government, are almost a non-negotiable element of the technology stack, right? What I would like to say here is that over the past few years, the European Commission in particular has tried to create the preconditions for a more diverse, a more nuanced, a more sophisticated approach to the way in which data flow on the internet. I'm going to show you a picture which is my own conceptualization of where the European Commission is leading when it comes to the digital single market more generally, and in particular data governance. So it will come all at once because these are PDF slides. I don't have the possibility of showing you an animation, so hopefully it doesn't come too abruptly. But the issue is that in the original layered architecture of the internet, there was no possibility of introducing layers such as verification, interoperability layers, and there was no possibility of really zoning or creating zones of cyberspace, as Larry Lessig originally would have called them, that make it possible to implement specific patterns and rules for data sharing, right? So apart from the bottom layers, which are becoming richer and richer than the original infrastructure, you see there, Internet of Things, the edge layer, connectivity, we are now having, first of all, the attempts to incorporate a number of rules for data sharing within the federated cloud, or so-called European Cloud Federation, a number of technical protocols and specifications that are now detailed in the so-called PRAAS, meaning the architecture solutions of the Gaia-X system. And these incorporate already some elements of mandatory interoperability in some cases of data without reaching a full detail there, and even mandatory compliance with the GDPR that sometimes, somehow already constrain and create an environment in which code, again to quote Lessig, defines what's possible in terms of data sharing. Now, on top of this, what we see is the emerging data spaces of the European Commission, the European Union, that they are creating a number of cross-cutting data spaces, in particular for skills, for the Green Deal, for the public administration, but also, as you see in the top left, an increasing sectoral, or perhaps borrowing the language of the last communication and industrial strategy, ecosystem-wide data spaces, where the real attempt is actually not to enable open sharing of data, but to enable constrained, managed data sharing, mostly between former real economy players, the car manufacturers, the farmers, and the pharmaceutical companies, and so on. Also, among other things, with in the attempt to strengthen their contractual power vis-a-vis the cloud-based giants that can tap into those markets and data in order to develop their own services. So the attempt is actually to rebalance the distribution of value. And in order to do this, the level of open data sharing on the internet actually is reduced to enable, we will see how, a more constrained approach and a more limited approach to data sharing, and perhaps, if you wish, a more regulated, sometimes self-regulated approach between companies to data sharing. Now, alongside with this, we'll still have the open internet, perhaps with digital ledger, distributed ledger technologies, coupled with the open internet, preserving the original openness of the internet architecture, the platforms as they have already emerged, and perhaps a specific data space, which is the one on digital government, that is in principle the one where government as a platform should incentivize as much as possible the availability of data, good quality data, for developing social innovation. And in all this, there is at least two important additional elements that are not really layers in this architecture, but they are important at all layers, at almost all layers. One is the artificial intelligence revolution that permeates many of those layers, so with the opportunities and the risks that it creates. And the other one is the original vocation for this set of reforms that is user-centric, meaning implementing protocols to increase and empower users through enhanced control over their personal data. So very difficult challenge that shows us perhaps something different from what we thought the internet originally stood for, which is purely open data spaces. So in my last slide, I just leave a number of open questions. In talking to players in this domain, in particular in the data economy at the EU level, I realized that most of the people feel lost, meaning the people that work mostly on user control over data, the solid people, the my data people, the IHAN people and others believe that the implementation of personal information management systems, so user control over data, is completely detached by the rest of the data strategy. The Data Governance Act is disconnected from the creation of data spaces at the moment. We don't know who will govern and how the data spaces. There are a number of interesting provisions on data, potentially even interoperability obligations in the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. The Digital Services Act also has a provision on access to data for researchers, in particular when it comes to so-called trusted flaggers, which is a first step towards perhaps openness for public interest purposes. There is a stream of initiatives on the data spaces that is supposed to find an interface with the so-called European Cloud Federation, which itself is supposed to be the scale-up of Gaia-X. All these things are in theory in progress. It's very difficult to see whether they will meet, exactly in a perfect spot, so that enables perfect seamless interoperability between these initiatives or not. I have some doubts at the moment. And finally, the data strategy of the Commission is still completely distant and disconnected from the overall industrial policy, and even the Commission's stance for open strategic autonomy, because many researchers around the world are looking at what Europe is doing on data and data sharing. The open strategic autonomy stances have led the Commission in some cases to even mull over the potential restrictions to data availability outside of the European Union or to non-European players. This, I think, would be a self-defeating choice in most respects. So I'm not sure I can give you any more certainty. I mean, I'm leaving many of these things open because we are at the beginning of our panel, and also because many of these initiatives are still being shaped by EU institutions, and I hope they'll be shaped in a way that makes sense over the coming months. That said, I will stop sharing my screen, and this concludes my presentation. I see Loretta is back, and so I might try to give Loretta back the floor as moderator, right? So thanks a lot.
Yes.
Loretta,
thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Just say yes. Go like
yes.
Okay, fine. So very provocative, and indeed it is a very complex field. So I've been working on self-sovereign identity, which is one way of giving users back control. We had a panel just 2 days ago, and many of the NGI innovators who are hackers, who are very competent, have found privacy loopholes. So yes, I think technologically speaking, it's also very complicated because, and I think Commissioner Breton started on this data sovereignty. The word sovereignty has attracted a lot of negative, but I remind everybody that the GDPR, when we talked about data privacy, the Americans thought we were crazy, about. So I think we have to learn that sovereignty means the ability to be able to print like a 3D printer when a special needs person needs to enter a room. and also the ability to have some of the vaccines that were funded through EU projects and produced locally for distribution. What I think is the good thing is that the imperative, as I said, to reset, to look at the value and the social without dividing the private from public sector and looking at the community of human beings first, I think this will reset many of our values. So I'm very happy to hear the brand new report that the UN charged Geoff Mulgan to lead. So Geoff is a professor of collective intelligence. I've known him more than 30 years. I'm always very happy and thank both, all three of my speakers for giving their time to us in this conference. Thank you so much. Over to you, Geoff.
Well, thank you very much, Loretta, and thanks, Andrea. I've already learned a lot this morning. And as you said, it's a hugely fascinating, complex, fluid field. I'm going to attempt to screen share, which I've never done with PDF files before, so may or may not work. And is it working? Oh, window, let's see. PowerPoint. That's not going to work, is it? Does that work? Can you see anything?
Yes, fine.
Yes, it works.
It does. Okay, magic. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is the relationship of some of these questions with social innovation and problem solving. And at the end, I will share a couple of frameworks which very much echo what Andrea was talking about in terms of the mix of public and private value and different forms of commons and data governance. So in a nutshell, as I see it, there's these sort of four sets of different goals which have to shape policy: growing and embedding rights, first for data, more and more for AI, new models, services which actually make the most of everything from the internet to blockchain to meet social needs, shifting the whole direction of our R&D, not just to the military, and click-through adverts, which has been the main purpose of internet innovation, but towards social goals. And finally, this question of organizing and governing the new data commons. And in a way, there's been lots on one, very successfully and necessarily, some progress on two, but I still think not that much on 3 and 4. And here is Etienne Laboiti. So some of you may know, 500 years ago or so, he wrote this extraordinary book on voluntary servitude. And I think it's the fear of kind of voluntary servitude in the internet has driven a lot of policy in the last 10 years, quite rightly, with GDPR, new rights in relation to the big platforms, privacy, et cetera, et cetera. And that all meant essentially a focus on constraining and restricting data flows, data sharing, et cetera. I want to focus on the flip side of that, which is really how we use these tools for societies and systems to think and act and learn. I wrote a book on this a few years ago on collective intelligence and really how at a collective level we do all the things listed there. We better observe the world, everything from carbon emissions to jobs, how we analyze, predict, remember, create, judge, and so on. And for me, this is the great question of our century, is whether we are able to do all these things intelligently around the issues which matter, which aren't just about click-through advertising. Now, one of the good things we've seen in the last 12 months is an extraordinary amount of civil society digital innovation around COVID, frontline using SMS, hot COVID responses, new uses of social media to create circles of support around the isolated or the elderly, platforms like Good Sam, which I was involved in shaping here, which mobilized nearly 1 million volunteers to help out the health. And in a way, we are seeing a flowering of digital innovation in the last 12 months as we are around education and health, as well as retail and finance because of lockdowns. This is one of the things which makes this moment so interesting. We're still in the early stages, though, of really using more sophisticated technology for social problem solving. One of the more prominent examples in the US was Allegheny County trying to use AI for predicting child maltreatment in order to guide social interventions. And this worked okay for them, though most of the work in this field still isn't actually very effective or much better than humans. But one of the big issues for the next 10 years is how do we really make the most of good AI, as it were, to help things like social services or education or precision medicine. And the irony is very, very little has been invested in the R&D on this compared to the R&D on AI for the military or intelligence agencies or Google, Facebook, Alibaba, and so on for new ways to sell things. This is one of the glaring gaps, I think still in Europe, but certainly globally as well. A few weeks ago, I wrote a piece for the Stanford Social Innovation Review, pulling some of this together. And I won't go through all of this, really looking at the relationship of the social economy and the fourth industrial revolution. It came out of work for JRC here in the European Commission. And his argument was essentially the social economy had very little influence over the evolution of the internet, the growth of the huge platforms and their clouds, contrary to expectations or promises before. And the same looks set to happen around AI in the next generation. And in the paper, I try to suggest what could be done now to be more strategic about both the legislation and governance, but also the generation of new tools, new technologies, and so on. Now, part of that is about collective intelligence, which is one of my obsessions. What we take from things like everyday things like Wikipedia, Zooniverse in science, which has now millions of people contributing citizen science, or things like Waze, owned by Google, where citizen input augments other forms of data analysis, collection, aggregation. And I see this as one of the crucial ways of, in a sense, making the world smarter, not in the kind of smart city sense, which is usually smart hardware and rather dumb citizens, but ways in which citizens with technology can co-create effective solutions. And Loretta mentioned this report, which came out a few weeks ago from the UN, which I helped write, which brings together dozens and dozens of experiments which have been run by the UNDP accelerator labs and other parts of the UN system using collective intelligence methods all over the world. They're now in over 100 countries, combining data, AI, collective intelligence to speed up solutions around gender equity, access to water, malnutrition, jobs, all of these things. And I would urge you to look at it. I think this is a kind of new common sense. Once you get familiar with these methods, it's sort of obvious this is the future of all public policy, all government, all social change. And yet we still have very limited capabilities in most countries actually to use these methods and understand how to weave them together. And that's why I'm so keen on the method here, which is lots of practical projects, as well as developing more serious theory about how AI and CI, for example, can come together. Europe doesn't yet have a program quite comparable, but I would love to see something like this as part of the Green Deal and post-COVID recovery plans. If part of this is about data, the other part is about organizing collective memory. And I just want to say a bit about this because quite a lot of my time at the moment is spent running this thing called the International Public Policy Observatory on COVID, where we link a global network or two global networks tracking what is being done around the world in response to COVID on education, health, care for the elderly, all these things, integrating that with massive sort of evidence syntheses using Microsoft Academic Graph, so millions and millions of research articles to create useful and usable insights for decision makers in governments, in civil society. And this, I think, is part of the future of data in a slightly different sense. How do we really orchestrate our shared knowledge in better ways? People sort of assume you can just Google it, but you can't actually. And everything that's important, what's striking is you need some people, some capability to do that knowledge synthesis to make it useful. The internet doesn't do it on its own. Now, many of these things are about organizing data as a commons. And one of the things I've been really interested in the last few years is the many initiatives trying to create new forms of data commons to support social innovation. So top right, ones like Open Energy this year from Icebreaker 1, trying to create energy data infrastructures as part of action on climate change. Bottom right, the Data for Children Collaborative, based in Edinburgh, as part of UNICEF, again, linking lots of children's data to support innovation. And on the left, one from my old organization, Nesta, where we've done lots on labor markets. How do you turn jobs information, skills information into a commons to help people make choices rather than it all being proprietary for LinkedIn, Google, and other companies? So 2 examples before I pull the threads together. So I've already mentioned this in relation to net zero. I think there's still a striking gap between the ambition of the plans on decarbonisation and net zero within companies, within many cities, and increasingly in the investment world, and surprising lack of engagement from the digital world. And yet I think to really move to a truly circular net zero economy, you need quite different ways of organising data and intelligence. On the bottom right, you can see some of the data, which I think needs to be organised much more as a commons: smart meter data, buildings, emissions, transport, energy grid data, and so on. You also need the kind of systematic organisation of evidence of what works on retrofitting homes or neighbourhood energy systems. And at the moment, this is very fractured and very fragmented. And that means we will have much less success in creating good machine learning or AI applications other than very proprietary ones dominated by existing players or by Google. So I think there's a doable task for the European Commission, which is having as essentially a data and intelligence strategy for the Green Deal and net zero, which then will underpin thousands and thousands of innovations of all kinds, social, economic, and so on. And I've not heard a good reason why this isn't happening yet. I think it's simply because the people involved in this field tend to come from material backgrounds. They're concerned with energy grids and things like that, or from the investment world, and the digital world hasn't really played its part. And the other one is on jobs, which I mentioned, where there's been a lot of interesting work trying to orchestrate jobs and intelligence so you can help people navigate their way through the turmoil, which is like to happen as ever more automation hits particular jobs, skill sets, etc. And again, I think a lot of this needs to be organized as commons. But, and this is where what I want to say, in a sense, overlaps with Andrea, and these are my final couple of points. Over the last few years, I've been trying to look at existing landscapes of data governance, and this precedes the most recent EU moves, trying to look at, on the left-hand axis, where you have to share, or where you have choice or control over sharing. And on the bottom axis, essentially notions of value. Is the value in this data purely personal, or is actually a huge amount of public value to be tapped? And this diagram summarizes a much more complex analysis, trying to picture different kinds of issue and players in this landscape, which is very varied. It isn't just purely public or private or shared or not shared. It's gradations. And then we try to work out what new frameworks for data governance could be to fit these different spaces. And exactly as Andrea was saying, there'll be some where you may want sharing within a sector with a limited number of players. And this is happening to a degree in fields like transport. In banking, you may want some sharing, but primarily giving control to the customer to decide who their data is shared with, as in open banking approaches. In others, like a lot of epidemic data, you want the maximum sharing so the research can be done on, could be new variants of COVID and so on. Anyway, this was a rough attempt at mapping a new institutional landscape of data governance to underpin social innovation, public governance, and private sector competitiveness, but to reap the maximum value from data rather than just trying to constrain it. And one of my frustrations has been in this world, very little alternatives or critiques or other models. There's a lot of rather vague, woolly discussion in this space, but it's hardly moved on. And most of the rating is still at a level of generality, which you can't really know what anyone would do about it if they were having to write legislation, etc. So, final point, for me, the interesting thing, after having put in place or alongside new rights, new rules in relation to data and AI, I think we need to focus on systems intelligence. How do we make our whole systems able to think and learn and act? And that's a precondition for both civil society, social innovation, and effective government. That means data much more often shared, open by default, often run as commons, but not always. It means much more systematic attention to evidence and interpretation. And there has to be some people, institutions who are charged with doing that. And the key test is whether the evidence they create is used. It's not enough just to have repositories. And one of the things I'm working at the moment is the fact we don't even have a name quite for the people whose job it would be to do this. I call them systems architects, because I think they are analogous to architects in the physical world who have to understand building materials, energy, economics, planning, aesthetics, and integrate these all into buildings we want to live in. We need exactly comparable skills for our digital world, our world of data, intelligence, artificial, collective, and so on, who can do that synthetic work. And at the moment, they don't exist. They're not trained in universities. They don't exist in governments. And yet, if we don't create this role in the next 10 years, we will not reap the full reward in terms of public and social value from the extraordinary volumes of data swirling around us. So I hope I just stopped sharing. Did I? Yes, I did.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Geoff. So Horizon Europe is the largest civilian open public research program. So the new program, Next Generation EU, has a difficulty that you've pointed, which is that digital used to be something like you push it for its own. So the idea of a twin transition, of putting both green and digital together, is conceptually a brand new challenge for me. For example, I funded, in fact, it was Nesta who did the study, Internet of Waste. And when I read how much my internet was wasting, I completely changed my mind on and started using data minimization. So only the necessary data. Normally in 1 hour of video, I would turn off my face because that removes a lot of the waste. So video streaming being one of the, unfortunately, we don't have the choice to be physically in the same conference. So yes, I mentioned the Horizon, the public open. I wanted to mention that communities are actually taking the lead. So in Flanders, there is a data collective community. And in fact, throughout Europe, I see communities in taking control of their energy needs, of their circular local farm to fork. However, in order to scale it up, it needs not just the EU, but a lot of leadership. And I think in addition to the architects, I think we need some political leaders. And now Michelangelo Secchi has been involved in some of the most exciting projects which actually try to help governance and data of local urban renewal projects. And this is for me starting from the grassroots community up. So it's not so much the economy as a whole, and not looking at the consumer of internet who just clicks on the ads, as Geoff mentioned, but actually the production of value that is collectively constructed and that engages citizens to solve their own problems, which sometimes is a lot faster than waiting for somebody to solve them for you. Michelangelo, over to you.
Thank you, Loretta. I'm trying also to share my screen. For some reason, I think I cannot share I will share the whole desktop, so I hope it's not a big issue. And here we are. Can you see my screen?
We can see it.
Pardon. I was at the end of the presentation. Yes, thank you very much. As Loretta was saying, I I mean, I will try to bring to this panel and complementary point of view that try to look from a bottom-up perspective to some of the topics that have been already discussed and developed by the two previous speakers. In particular, I've been working for many years. I have a social science background, and I've been working for many years in local civic engagement processes, in particular studying participatory budgeting, and let's say those kind of public-private collaborative settings that in recent years, while up to a few years ago were delivered in offline settings, in recent years had to face issues related to the introduction of platforms that highly increased the generation, the collection, and the related questions related to the management of personal data of the people involved in this kind of processes. No? So these are just a few examples. In this presentation, I refer generically to collaborative and participatory platform, even though there are relative relevant differences between these two categories. But in general, I'm referring to those kind of platforms that are linked to a territorialized community, and either if they are directly promoted by public authorities like a municipality, a city, or generally a local authority, or by the community itself, and that are used generally to manage in democratic processes related to the community itself. And in this sense, let's say, social science, democracy studies, there is always this assumption underlying the running of this kind of process, that is the idea that by, let's say, by experimenting in practice like direct democracy, participatory democracy processes, these would generally, let's say, increase the democratic skills and reinforce the democratic capacity of the society that run this kind of experimental processes. So there is a scaling out perspective on these practices, and somehow, let's say, the idea is that if these processes embed good data management practices, these can somehow be also a driver, at least from a bottom-up perspective, of good practices of data management within the public domain mainly, but also in other, let's say, community organized settings. So three, some points. So this kind of platforms generally, what kind of data they collect. I mean, some of these are really simplification done to deliver the presentation in a short amount of time. So obviously, many of these definitions can overlap and can be discussed, but take this just as a way to present the topic. So the data, generally, we can distinguish between the personal data, the data of the users. Most of these processes are also have embed, like, for example, participatory budgeting, that have a kind of binding effect on public resources. They require to authenticate users. So there is generally a huge question related to the way personal data of participants are managed throughout this kind of process. And then there are other kind of user-generated content that we can distinguish between those content that are generated purposefully by users. And just to make some example, these are, for example, in participatory budgeting or in many of these platforms, are the proposals for projects of urban transformation, proposal of new projects of social innovation at local levels. These are typical, let's say, when we think to sometimes to collective intelligence, to the way in which these kind of processes are actually capable to generate public value, we also think to this kind of data, to this kind of information which is positive with that purpose. But this platform also generates a lot of other data related to the interaction between users, their own preferences, and let's say there is a huge amount of data which can be extracted, even though if it's not, let's say, purposefully introduced by the user in this kind of program, as in I would say, any other kind of digital platform. What could be the purpose? What could be the use, or what purpose of the reuse of this kind of data? Obviously, let's say it's generally emphasized the dimension of the research and the scientific purposes. So this kind of data can be used to assess the democratic quality of a given city, the way in which, I don't know, a specific topic is discussed, and all these kind of questions, which are obviously really relevant, not just for researchers themselves. They are really relevant for their use in the design and let's say policy making in general terms, because they provide direct feedback on public policies, and it's especially related to the, let's say, participatory platform managed by public authorities. And obviously there is also the idea that these data also have a value which is also an economic value. We'll not go too much into this point because it's been discussed by the first speech. I would just say that also in this case there is always a big discussion regarding the capacity to actually attribute an economic value to this kind of data, and this somehow makes it difficult to use other kind of, let's say, of mechanisms that justify for example, the effort of public authority in investing resources in designing and deploying say, correct data management in this kind of setting. Regarding the ownership of data, obviously, I mean, also in this case, this is an exemplary case in which we have a mix and a blend between public, private, and the commons data, and all, let's say, the gray shades that also stays in between these macro definitions. And for sure, this kind of platform can be considered somehow emblematic of this typology of data, and it's clear and it's more easy to understand what it means. So let's say that if we have to look a bit to the main challenges, there are two main pushes that, especially for local authorities, have been driving and have been steering the policies and the approaches to data management in this kind of settings, so in participatory settings, that I think can also be applied to other category of data. And this is, let's say, also on one end, the push toward the open access and the reusability of data, so I'm providing the technical, legal, and organizational condition to reuse the data collected, and on the other hand, let's say, control limitation approach that have been already presented before, that somehow strongly focus on the protection of the privacy and the protection of the data, and the measures to be implemented to ensure that citizens' data can be somehow, citizens' data management can be somehow controlled in a proper manner. So the challenges, as I was saying, have three, let's say, at least three kind of three main categories. They have legal challenges related to the way in which this platform can ensure compliance with the GDPR and proper anonymization protocols for the personal identifiers. And obviously there is a lot of discussion regarding what kind of licenses should be applied for the content generated by this kind of platforms. Let's say it's similar to they can use licenses that are, say, the one generally coming from the discussion of licensing commons, digital commons, so Creative Commons first of all, on the open data licenses. There are organizational choices to be put in place regarding the introjection or the externalization of the management structure that we run the platform and their data, and the technical framework to be decided that regards exactly where the data are physically stored and who technically has the access to this kind of data. the combination of these elements can generate a variety of possible scenarios of data management. We don't have the time to discuss them in detail, but here I have been mapping in a former project several models of data management in participatory platform. Let's say that what can be interesting is that somehow these kind of scenarios they have a correspondence. They have let's say they are mirrored in the vision, also the political vision that some of these cities express with regards to the idea of social innovation and the social relation. So, as I was saying in the beginning, I will try to run how data can, there are three questions related to data and civic engagement. So, question related to trust. The trust generated in participatory setting can scale out, impact positively the whole digital ecosystem. The problem of inclusion and the problem of involving citizens and inhabitants in topics related to digital transformation. So, to open actually this, just to remind that in practice, this kind of platform and this kind of process, they are still strongly biased in terms of inclusion. So they have the capacity to include mainly people who has high degree of education, relevant digital skill, and so on. So never forget this point, and proper policies has to be set up to manage this inclusion question. There are somehow advanced experiments on the field. I quoted the code, which I think it's well known by at least the speakers of this panel, which was a project running trying exactly to deploy a decentralized system for data management that was giving back to citizens the possibility to directly control the data. This is not, let's say, standard diffused, but there are actual relevant field experiment and a lot of ongoing research that try to understand the relation between data management, democracy, value creation, public value creation. Here I mentioned some of the most let's say the most popular that have been running in recent years. So I was concluding with some recommendation that I think have to speed up. So I will just let's say focus on the fact that the local levels and the cities in particular, but also the community, are key players in data management and are key players in reconstructing the trust of user towards the public data management and towards the role that public can have in making their data, funneling the data into public value generation. To do that, superior, supra-local authorities have, as they some have been doing in this year, but they have to do it more systematically, more consistently, to provide the standards, deploy infrastructure that can support those smaller authorities that do not have this capacity, and provide also capacitation programs that are capable to distribute skills that somehow should be capable to generate locally the capacity to design and manage open digital ecosystem entrenched into the local participatory sphere. So I conclude here. I'm sorry if I've been a bit too long.
No, thank you. So I tend to agree with your point, because I have seen that when things get difficult, so when there's high growth, the political system redistributes to its own and everything works. But when you have degrowth or zero growth or 50% carbon reduction, when you have these degrowthing patterns, which I think we'll see, the most important thing is to have the engagement of citizens, not to leave people out. Because if you are part of that decision, you're much more willing to do the necessary changes. And so I think the point you mentioned there is really important. And just 2 words. Finally, in my view, trust is at an all-time low, largely because of what you mentioned before. And I think unless we put back trust in an end-to-end or community-based trust, or because we can't trust things that are machine-generated, and a lot of people get their news on TikTok. Well, that's not going to help trust. So the fight to make trust an element of all our digital interactions through the internet is really important. And on competitiveness, I think that the social part will play a much stronger role. I have the statistics on how much the data economy contributes. Of course, the UK always comes first. Netherlands comes second, I think. But in a few years, we're going to see that the data, these figures are going to go up. So I think the data economy and the social contribution to value, we're going to see in a couple of years, those are going to be very important. So we've run out of time. So I really wanted to thank the participants, but especially the 3 exceptional speakers. We keep mentioning Decode and some of these projects, which I was the PO at the. So I'm very happy to see that the motto of this conference is not output, but outcomes. And I think you've really changed the outcome, both in the policy and in the data. So I just wanted to send you personal thank you for everybody, and we will distribute the information later. Thank you so much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.